"Take off the apron," Royce Delacroix said, and the whole tasting room went quiet. It was 10:20 on a Saturday morning in September, inside the oldest bakery in Memphis, Tennessee. A two-story brick storefront on Vance Avenue with flour worked so deep into the floorboards that 50 years of mopping had only turned them a paler shade of gold, and a screen door on the alley side that had slapped shut the same tired way since the Ford administration. 53 people stood shoulder to shoulder between the proofing racks, and a banner that read Legacy Lounge in rose gold letters. A food writer from the daily paper had come with a photographer. A two-person crew from a streaming network was rolling footage for a docuseries about the brand. Royce Delacroix, 44 years old, chief executive of Delacroix Provisions, 91 cafés, and a grocery line across 11 states, stood on a low riser built out of stacked flour sacks, holding a microphone in one hand and his grandmother's worn wooden dough scraper in the other, the one the marketing deck called the soul of the company. And in front of him, holding a push broom, stood a 63-year-old black man in a gray utility shirt with the name Silas stitched in red over the heart. 9 minutes. That is how long the thing you are about to watch took, from the first laugh to the last signature. 9 minutes that would end up costing one of these two men every cafe, every supplier contract, every trademark, and the family name over the door that his grandmother had signed her whole life into. And I am going to tell you right now, before we take one more step, that it would not be the man holding the broom. The launch that morning was supposed to be a coronation. Royce was retiring the original recipe book, the leather one his grandmother had written by hand, the book the whole empire had risen out of, and he was rolling out a reformulated commercial line instead. Cheaper flour, longer shelf life, a co-packer plant up in Ohio. There were pastries fanned out on butcher paper, and a speech about the future typed by an agency in Nashville, and a demolition permit already filed to gut the Vance Avenue kitchen into a photo studio by the second week of November. The old building lost money every month it stood. The recipe book, Royce liked to tell investors, was a museum piece, and museums do not scale. Royce was 3 minutes into that speech when he noticed Silas Freeman sweeping the spilled flour by the number 2 oven. Understand something before you judge what comes next. Silas was not interrupting anything. The overnight cleaning contract ran until 11 in the morning, and the tile in front of the oven had a slick of proof dust and oil on it that somebody, sooner or later, was going to spawn and sue over. Silas had been sweeping that exact stretch of floor for 4 years. He was doing his job, quietly, the way he did every single thing. But Royce Delacroix was the kind of man who could not stand to share a room, not even with a broom. He stopped mid-sentence, pointed the dough scraper across the tasting room like a small wooden sword, and let out a laugh aimed straight at the cameras. "Well, would you look at that?" he said. "The one man in Memphis who still thinks this old room means something." The employees laugh the way. Employees laugh when the person signing their checks decides something is funny. Silas kept sweeping. He did not look up. In Royce's eyes, that was the offense. Royce Delacroix needed to be looked at. "You there," he said louder now, stepping down off the flour sacks with the microphone still live in his hand. "What do they call you, Chief?" Silas straightened up slowly, the way a man straightens when his back has carried more than the payroll ever knew, and he leaned the broom handle against the brick. "Silas Freeman, sir. Silas Freeman," Royce repeated, tasting the name like he was deciding whether to spit it out. "Tell me something, Silas Freeman. What do we pay you to push that broom around my grandmother's floor?" The room went very still. A 27-year-old counter lead named Dana Whitfield, born and raised off Lamar Avenue, first in her family to hold a salaried job, stood near the register with a clipboard of launch checklists pressed against her chest, and she would testify later under oath that she felt the whole morning tip sideways in that one question, like a tray going off a rack in slow motion. Silas answered plainly, because plain was the only way the man had ever talked. $2,118 a month, sir. After taxes, it comes to less. Royce turned back to his audience, delighted, and here is where his mouth signed a contract that his lawyers would spend the next 19 months trying to set on fire. $2,118, he said into the microphone, stretching every syllable so the cameras could drink it. "You know what, folks? I came down here to close the book on this building. It costs me money every day it stands. The roof sweats. The basement is full of 40 years of paper nobody will ever read again. He spread his arms wide, and the watch on his wrist caught the pendant lights. So let's make a little history instead. Silas Freeman, I will sell you this bakery, the building, the land under it, the ovens, the name painted on that window, and every crumbling, worthless thing inside these walls. As is, where is. All fixtures, equipment, files, recipes, records, and contents. For exactly 1 month of your pay, $2,118. Let the janitor buy the bakery. People laughed. Not everybody. A pastry lead named Bet Oduya, who had baked on that floor for 22 years, closed her eyes the way a woman closes her eyes in church when somebody says a thing that should not be said out loud. An old delivery driver stared hard at the toes of his boots. And Dana Whitfield did the bravest thing anyone did that morning. She stepped forward 9 months into the only real job she had ever had, and she said, "Mr. Delacroix, sir, with respect, you shouldn't talk to him like that. Not in front of everybody." Royce did not even turn his head. "Somebody make a note to write that girl up," he said. And the laughter came again. And this time it had a nervous, ugly edge to it, the sound people make when they are relieved the joke has not landed on them. Then Silas Freeman wiped his hands on the rag from his back pocket, looked at Royce Delacroix for the first time all morning, really looked at him, the way you look at a man you have already forgiven and are about to hold accountable anyway. And he said 7 words in a voice so level that both cameras drifted in to catch it. "I will take that deal in writing." Silence. Real silence, the kind with weight in it. Royce's grin flickered because a joke only stays a joke as long as nobody accepts it. His general counsel, a careful, gray-templed woman named Adele Cohn, who had flown in from the Nashville office for the launch, crossed the floor fast and said something low and urgent against the dead side of the microphone. Everybody watching saw what Royce did next. He waved her off. 1 flick of the wrist, maybe 3 inches of motion. Remember that wave. Empires do not usually fall to armies. They fall to 3 inches of a man's wrist, on a Saturday morning in front of witnesses on camera. Because Royce Delacroix had a food writer taking notes, a docuseries crew rolling, 53 employees watching, and an ego that had not once in 44 years been told no in public. Backing down would have made him the punchline of his own launch, and Royce would burn a building down before he would be a punchline. "Draw it up," he said, "all contents, right now." It took Adele Cohn 35 minutes to draft 9 pages on a laptop balanced on a display of loaf tins. And witnesses would remember that she asked Royce twice, quietly, to reconsider, and that the second time he said something to her that made the older woman's jaw tighten and her eyes go flat and professional. The purchase agreement sold the real property at 1149 Vance Avenue, the improvements thereon, and all fixtures, furnishings, equipment, inventory files, recipes, records, and contents located therein. As is, where is, with all faults, for a purchase price of $2,118. A notary from the credit union 2 doors down, who had wandered over for the free pastries, was pressed into service and stamped every signature. The docuseries crew filmed the whole thing because Royce asked them to. He thought he was making content. Silas Freeman paid in cash. He counted it out of a soft envelope he had been carrying, folded in his jacket all week. Money set aside to fix the transmission on the 12-year-old sedan he drove to 2 jobs. 105 20s, 110 and 8 ones, counted twice and stacked in neat little towers on the folding table next to the pastry boxes. He did not rush, he did not shake. When the last single settled onto the pile, he picked up the grandmother's dough scraper, the one Royce had been waving around all morning without ever once wondering what it had shaped in its lifetime. And he did not use it, he set it down gently, because it was not his to take yet by feel, even if it was his now by law. And instead he took from his own shirt pocket a cheap ballpoint pen and signed his name the way his mother had taught him at a kitchen table 40 years before, full and legible, pressing hard, so that nobody could ever pretend they did not know exactly who had signed. Royce leaned into the microphone one last time. "Let the record show," he said. "The janitor bought the bakery. Congratulations, Mr. Freeman. You are now the proud owner of the deadest kitchen in Tennessee." Silas folded his copy of the contract into thirds, slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket, picked his broom back up, and finished the flour line by the number 2 oven. Then he rinsed the broom head in the mop sink, knocked it dry against the drain, hung it on the rack by the alley door, the way he had every morning for 4 years, and walked out through the screen door that had slapped shut the same way since the Ford administration, catching it with his heel so it would not bang, the way everyone who worked in that building had learned to catch it. 19 months later, Silas Freeman owned all 91 cafés. Not through a lottery ticket, not through a miracle, not through some stranger descending out of the clouds to reward a good man for his patience. Through paper, through patience, through a basement that Royce Delacroix, in 11 years of running his grandmother's company, had never once bothered to walk down into. Listen closely, because this story is not really about bread, and it is not really about money. It is about what happens when a man spends 40 years being underestimated by people who confuse a uniform with a mind. It is about the difference between the people who collect grievances and the people who collect proof. From the back of a crowded room, standing quietly against the wall, those two kinds of people can look exactly alike. They are not the same animal at all. And to understand what was folded in thirds inside Silas Freeman's jacket that morning, and why his hands did not shake while he counted out that cash, you have to go back more than 50 years, to a narrow rented house on the south side of Memphis that smelled like yeast and machine oil, and a cast iron skillet that was never once allowed to go dry. Silas Freeman was born in the spring of 1961, the second of 4 children, in a shotgun house 3 blocks off South Parkway, close enough to the rail yards that the whole street learned to talk in the gaps between freight trains. His father worked 29 years greasing rolling stock in those yards, coming home every evening with hands stained the color of strong coffee and a lunch pail that rattled with the one wrench the company allowed a man to keep. His mother, Verna Freeman, baked before dawn for a white tablecloth restaurant downtown that let her in through the kitchen door, praised her rolls to the guests, and never once let her name reach the menu. She cleaned 2 houses in the afternoons for families who called her Verna, while she was required to call them by their last names. Verna Freeman had one lesson she taught more often than any scripture, and she taught it to Silas the day he came home from school with his eyes hot and wet, because a teacher had marked his long division wrong when it was right, and had refused to check the work. Verna did not march up to the school. She did not write a letter. She sat her boy down at the kitchen table, put the paper flat in front of him, and made him work the whole problem again out loud, every step, all the way through to the same correct answer. Then she said the sentence he would carry in his chest for the rest of his life. "Baby, you do not need to be seen. You need to be right. Being seen is their job to fix. Being right is yours to keep." He was right about the arithmetic. The grade was never corrected. Silas kept that paper anyway, folded into a King Edward cigar box for more than 50 years. Remember that cigar box. Men like Silas Freeman do not throw away proof. He learned to bake standing on a milk crate beside his mother in the dark, and he learned 2 things at once that most people never learn at all. He learned that a recipe is not a list, it is a sequence. An order of operations where the difference between a thing that rises and a thing that sinks is the 2 minutes you let the butter come to temperature. And he learned that his mother's hands knew things her paycheck was not allowed to admit she knew. By the time he was 17, he could feel when a dough was slack by the sound it made against the side of the bowl. And by the time he was 20, he had filled the first of what would become 40 years of black spiral notebooks. Bought 3 at a time from a drugstore on Elvis Presley Boulevard, with diagrams and hydration ratios and small stubborn sentences about why a thing worked. He was 22, in the winter of 1983, when he took a job at a single storefront bakery on Vance Avenue for $3.10 an hour, and he was glad to get it. The bakery belonged to a widow named Cordelia Delacroix, a heavy-set woman with reading glasses on a chain and a habit of standing in the middle of her own kitchen at 4 in the morning, saying nothing, just listening to the ovens the way a farmer listens to weather. She was Royce's grandmother. She was, though neither of them knew it yet that cold morning, the closest thing to a second mother that Silas Freeman would ever have. 3 weeks into the job, Cordelia walked into her own back kitchen at dawn and stopped dead in the doorway. The proofing schedule had been rewritten, not erased, reordered. The slow-rising sourdoughs had been moved to the front of the night, so they would be ready when the fast breakfast breads needed the oven, and a hand-drawn chart was tacked to the wall that mapped which dough went in which oven at which temperature, so that no oven ever sat cold and empty for even 10 minutes, which in a bakery is the difference between a business and a hobby. Cordelia stood there a long moment. Then she walked to the back sink where a young man was scrubbing sheet pans, and she asked one question. "Son, who taught you to think like that?" And Silas, who did not yet know he was talking to the rest of his life, said, "Nobody taught me, ma'am. I just got tired of watching good ovens sit cold." Cordelia Delacroix took off her reading glasses and laughed until she had to put a hand on the counter. Now here is the part no business school ever writes down, and it is the hinge this whole story turns on. Silas Freeman had a gift, and the gift was not only for bread, although the man could make bread that stopped conversation. The gift was for systems. He could stand in the middle of a chaotic kitchen and see it the way other people see a stalled engine, as a set of flows that somebody had assembled in the wrong order. Where other people saw noise, he saw sequence. Within a year, Cordelia had him running the ovens. Within 3, he was writing the recipes down beside her, taking her instinct and turning it into a repeatable thing that could survive her, which is the only kind of egg legacy that survives anybody. Together they filled the leather book, the one the marketing deck would one day call the soul of the company. And it was true. It was the soul. But half the handwriting in that book was his, and no camera in Nashville ever knew it. He built a reconditioning routine that stretched the life of the ovens by 6 years. He designed a morning huddle, 15 minutes, where the bakers and the counter and the delivery driver stood in one room and settled in person what they used to settle by blame. The people who worked there stopped calling any of it anything fancy. They just called it the way Silas does it. Cordelia opened her second storefront in 1991, out in Whitehaven, and it was Silas who wrote the playbook that opened it. The third came in 1994, the fourth in 1997. Each time, Cordelia would drive him over in her long brown Oldsmobile with a thermos of chicory coffee, sweating on the seat, between them, and they would spend 3 weeks turning a failing shop into a Delacroix shop, which by then really meant a Freeman shop, though only one of those 2 names ever went up on the glass. In the spring of 1998, on the drive home from opening the 6th store, Cordelia pulled the Oldsmobile onto the gravel shoulder of Highway 61 outside town, put it in park, and sat quiet for a minute with both hands on the wheel. Then she said, "Silas, I have been paying you a baker's wage for a partner's work, and I am ashamed of myself it took me this long to say it out loud." 2 weeks later, at the June meeting of the Board of Directors of Delacroix Provisions, which in those days was Cordelia, her banker, her accountant, and her lawyer, around a folding table in the back office, Cordelia put through a resolution. It granted Silas Freeman a 10% ownership interest in the company, in recognition, the minutes read, of extraordinary and continuing contributions to the recipes, systems, and operation of the enterprise. The accountant recorded the entry in the corporate stock ledger, a green cloth-bound book with a black spine. The resolution was typed on onion skin, signed by every director, and slid into the company minute book. Cordelia shook his hand across the folding table and said, "Now it is on paper, son, because a handshake dies with the people who shook it, but paper outlives everybody." Hold on to that sentence. Paper outlives everybody. Cordelia Delacroix had no idea how right she was, or which side of that truth her own grandson would one day land on. Silas drove home that evening to the little house he rented off Kerr Avenue and told the woman he loved, and Marguerite, who taught 4th grade at a school off Airways Boulevard and had married him in 1989 in the Fellowship Hall of Mount Pisgah Baptist with $60 of grocery store carnations, and 200 people, cried and wear his good shirt to Wednesday Bible study. For no reason, except that she wanted to look at him in it. Except that she wanted to look. You need to know about Marguerite, because everything Silas did later in this story, he did with her voice in his ear alongside his mother's. She kept a garden of collards and okra in the back of the rented house and gave most of it away. She had one rule in her classroom and the same rule in her home, and she said it so often the children could finish it for her. We do not answer ugly with ugly. We answer ugly with excellent. For his birthday in the fall of 2002, with the company at 11 storefronts and Silas running operations for all of them, Marguerite gave her husband a shirt. Not an expensive one. A blue chambray work shirt from a farm supply store out on Summer Avenue because he had worn his old one to threads. He wore that shirt every Saturday for the rest of her life, and every Saturday after it ended. When the collar frayed, she turned it. When the elbow blew out, she patched it from the inside so the patch would not show. Because, she said, a man's mending is his own business. If you have ever wondered why some men wear an old shirt when they could afford a closet full of new ones, this is why. Some clothes are clothes. Some clothes are a hand on your shoulder. Those were the good years, and I am not going to rush past them. Because you cannot measure what was stolen from a man until you have seen what he built. By 2009, there were 19 storefronts and the first grocery contract. Cordelia was slowing down, her heart doing arithmetic of its own, and her grandson Royce, then 31, freshly home from business school and 2 years at a brand consulting firm in Atlanta, had joined the company as chief marketing officer. Royce wore his watch loose, so it swung when he gestured. He called the storefronts units. He called the baker's head count. He looked at his grandmother's folding table board and saw something embarrassing. And he looked at his grandmother's operations man and saw something worse. He saw a rail yard greaser's son with a green ledger entry that was by then worth real money. Royce was never loud about it. Give him that much. He was patient the way water is patient with a roofline. In meetings he would let Silas finish, then say with a small smile aimed at the bankers, "That is beautiful, that is heritage, but the market has moved on from folklore." He hired consultants from Atlanta at $400 an hour to rewrite, in laminated binders, systems that Silas had already written by hand, and he presented those binders to lenders as proof of modernization. The binders were the way Silas does it, with the Silas taken out. Here is a question I want you to sit with, because it is the question this whole story is asking. What do you call it when a man does not steal your wallet, but steals the record that the wallet was ever yours? There is a word for that in the law. You are going to hear the word before we are done. On the 4th of February 2011, Cordelia Delacroix had a stroke at her desk in the back office on Vance Avenue, her reading glasses still on the chain around her neck, halfway through signing a stack of vendor checks. Silas was the one who found her. Silas rode in the ambulance to the Med on Jefferson, holding the old woman's hand and talking low and steady the whole way about the spring flower order, about anything, because he had read somewhere that the hearing is the last thing to go. She lived, if you want to call it living. The stroke took most of her speech and her right side with it, and she spent her last 3 years in a care home out toward Bartlett, in a room with a window facing a parking lot. Every second Sunday for 3 years. After church, Silas and Marguerite drove out there with a thermos of chicory coffee, and Silas would sit by the bed and read her the baking trade papers and tell her which stores were up and which were down, as if the numbers still belonged to both of them. Royce visited his grandmother 4 times in 3 years. The care home kept a visitor log. Care homes always keep a visitor log. Paper outlives everybody. Royce moved fast in the spring of 2011, and he moved the way he had been trained, through documents. Holding a durable power of attorney and control of the family trust that owned the voting shares, he called a special meeting of a board he had quietly restocked with 2 friends from Atlanta. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, the position of Director of Operations had been eliminated as part of what the minutes called a strategic modernization, its functions absorbed into a new management framework. Silas Freeman, 28 years with the company, was offered a severance of $35,000, conditioned on his signature, on a separation agreement with a confidentiality clause, and a broad release of all claims. He sat in Royce's new glass-walled office, and he asked one question: "What about my 10%? And Royce Delacroix leaned back in his chair, made a small show of paging through a folder, and said the sentence he would hear read back to him, word for word, in a deposition 12 years later. "What 10%? I have been through the corporate records, Silas. There is no stock certificate anywhere with your name on it. If my grandmother made you some kind of promise across a table once, I am sorry, but I cannot run a company on folklore. This business runs on paper now. There was no certificate. That much was true. Cordelia ran a folding table company. The ownership lived in the resolution, in the minutes, in the green ledger, the way it does in 10,000 small family corporations across this country. Silas knew those documents existed. He had watched them sign. But in the spring of 2011, his wife was teaching 4th grade. His mother was in the last year of her life. The woman who could have vouched for him could no longer form a full sentence, and the documents were locked inside a company that was now entirely in the hands of the man denying they existed. He talked to a lawyer in a strip mall off Poplar who was honest with him. Without the minute book, it is your memory against their records. And their records are in their building. Cases like this are won with paper, Mr. Freeman, and right now they are holding all of it. So Silas Freeman did the hardest thing a right man can do. He did not sign the separation agreement. He left the $35,000 sitting on the table, because a release of claims is a door that locks from the inside, and something in him, something with his mother's voice in it, refused to hand over the key. Royce took the refusal as wounded pride and let him walk, and even joked to Adele Cohn's predecessor that the baker's boy had just tipped the house 35 grand. Remember that too. The papers Silas refused to sign in 2011 were the reason the courthouse doors were still standing open to him in 2023. Royce thought he had won twice. He had in fact lost twice, and he would not find out for 12 years. Silas was 50 years old, and he started over. He ran the kitchen at a soul food restaurant on Elvis Presley Boulevard for a while. He consulted quietly for a barbecue chain in Southaven that paid him in checks and in respect. He and Marguerite were careful people. The little house was nearly paid off, and they did not fall, but there is a kind of falling that never shows up on a bank statement. For 28 years, his mind had run a machine of 19 kitchens, and now the machine ran without him, badly, and he could see it running badly from the outside. The way a surgeon watches bad stitching on a television show. Delacroix Provisions grew to 91 cafés on the debt markets, and the momentum of what he had built, and the culture curdled a little more every year. Bakers he had trained called him at night to ask him questions Royce's laminated binders could not answer. He always picked up. Then, in the summer of 2019, Marguerite found the lump, and by Christmas the doctors had stopped talking in years. She died on the 9th of March, 2020. At home, in the front bedroom of the house off Kerr Avenue, holding her husband's hand, wearing her good yellow robe, with the spring garden already turned, because that was who she was. The last thing she said that made it all the way into words, and Silas wrote it down that same night so he would never let his memory smooth it over, was this. Finish it excellent, baby. Whatever it turns out to be. Finish it excellent. Grief does a strange arithmetic with a man's days. Silas was 59. Alone in a too-quiet house, with a small pension and a mind that had never once in its life agreed to sit still. And so in the fall of 2020, he did a thing that his niece thought was heartbreaking, and his barber thought was crazy, and nobody at all understood correctly. A commercial cleaning contractor held the overnight janitorial contract for the original Delacroix bakery on Vance Avenue. Silas applied under his own name. The contractor's hiring manager was 23 and had never heard of him. Corporate HR up in Nashville never saw the paperwork of a subcontracted night janitor at a dying store, and Royce Delacroix had not set foot inside the Vance Avenue kitchen in years because failing stores embarrassed him, and this one was scheduled to die. Why? Why would a man who had helped build an empire push a broom through it at night for $2,118 a month? His niece asked him straight out, one Sunday over smothered chicken, and Silas wiped his mouth and answered her straight back. Because your uncle helped build that place, baby, and a man is allowed to sit a while with what he built. Because Cordelia is gone now and somebody ought to look in on the old rooms. And then he said the third reason, quietly, looking down at his plate. And because the paper is still in that building, nobody ever moves the paper. They will demolish a building on top of it before they will ever carry it out. He knew, you see. He had known for 12 years. Down a switchback stair behind the walk-in cooler, under the Vance Avenue store, was a basement that ran the full footprint of the building, dry, cool, and forgotten, where Cordelia Delacroix, a woman who had lived through hard times and never in her life thrown away a sign-paid page, had ordered every box of company records archived since 1983. The minute book, the stock ledger, the board resolutions, and the paper trail of everything the company had done since, because when Royce built his glossy headquarters up in Nashville in 2015, he had scanned what the consultants called active files and paid a moving crew to shove the rest, pallet after pallet, down into the cheapest storage he owned, which happened to be the basement of the store he was already starving toward demolition. Silas had watched the trucks do it. He had been standing across Vance Avenue on the sidewalk, on his lunch break from the barbecue job, the afternoon they did it. For 3 years, he swept those floors at night, and he never once went down those stairs, because the boxes belonged to Delacroix Provisions, and Silas Freeman does not touch what is not his. I need you to hear that plainly, because it is the whole difference between this man and the one upstairs. 3 years. One locked door between him and his proof, and he never turned the handle, because being right was his job, and he refused to be wrong in the way he went about becoming right. He was waiting. If you had asked him what for, he would have told you the truth. He did not know. His mother would have called it faith, and she would not have been wrong. And then, on a Saturday morning in September of 2023, in front of 53 witnesses, a food writer, a docuseries crew, and a notary who had come for the pastries, Royce Delacroix stood on a riser of flour sacks and sold Silas Freeman the building. The land, the ovens, the name on the window, and every crumbling, worthless thing inside those walls. As is, where is, all fixtures, equipment, files, recipes, records, and contents for exactly 1 month of a janitor's pay. Now you understand why his hands did not shake. Let us go back to that morning one more time, and this time let us slow it all the way down, because the 9 minutes you watched at the start were not 9 minutes to everyone in that room. To one man, they were the closing of a 12-year circle. To one young woman, they were the morning. She found out what her own spine was made of. Dana Whitfield had been at Delacroix 9 months. Counter lead, Vance Avenue, the last counter lead the store would ever have, ringing up the final loaves of a dying bakery. She was the daughter of a hospital orderly and a hair braider, first in her family to finish community college, 27 years old, still driving the hatchback she had bought at 19. She had learned 2 things in 9 months. The first was that the quiet night janitor knew more about how a bakery actually worked than anyone in the building, because one evening she had stayed late fighting with a jam-proofing schedule that had 3 orders colliding at one oven, near tears, and the man sweeping past her had paused, looked at the board for 4 seconds, and said gently, "Pull the rye. First, it can rest cold longer than the brioche can wait, and give the brioche the front oven." It took her one morning to prove him right. She never forgot it. The second thing she had learned was that when corporate came down, you kept your head below the counter line. On that Saturday, she forgot the second thing because of the first. The launch had been strange from the start. Royce arrived at 9:15 with an assistant and the camera crew, walked the tasting room the way a man walks through a house he intends to sell, and told the assistant, loud enough for the bakers to hear, that the whole place smelled like 1985. Bet Oduya, 22 years on that floor, heard it and said nothing, and something in her shoulders came down half an inch and stayed there. At 10:12, Royce took the riser. At 10:20, he saw the broom. You know the words by now. I will not make you hear all of them again. But there are 3 details the cameras caught that matter more than the words. The first is what the room did. 53 people. And when Royce asked a 63-year-old man to say his own wage out loud into a microphone, not one of them moved. That is not because they were cruel. Most of them were decent people with rent due and kids in daycare. And that is exactly the thing I need you to carry out of this story. Injustice rarely needs villains in quantity. It needs one confident man with a microphone and 53 people with rent in the room. The silence of good people is the loudest sound in this entire story. And Silas heard it clearly, and forgave it faster than most of them ever forgave themselves. The second detail is Dana. When she stepped out from behind the register and said, "Sir, with respect, you shouldn't talk to him like that," her voice cracked right in the middle of it, and she planted her feet the way you do when your knees have opinions of their own. Make a note to write that girl up. Laughter. And here is the moment inside the moment. Silas turned his head, found her eyes across the tasting room, and gave her a nod so small that only she and one camera operator ever saw it. She would say later that the nod felt like somebody co-signing a loan she was terrified she could not repay. 19 months after that morning, she would find out exactly what that nod was worth. We will get there. The third detail is the clause. When Adele Cohn drafted the agreement on that laptop, she wrote it the way careful lawyers write things they hate, as protectively as the client's ego would allow. And she tried. She looked up and said, "Royce, at minimum let me carve out the recipe book and the business records. We will crate them and move them next week." And Royce Delacroix, standing tall for the cameras, said the 11 words that ended his empire. "Leave it all. I want the trash to convey with the trash. All fixtures, equipment, files, recipes, records, and contents. As is. Where is. With all faults." Adele Cohn typed it, and a muscle jumped in her jaw, and being the kind of lawyer who documents her own warnings, she would remember that exchange with perfect clarity when she was asked about it under oath. Kindness was not why she remembered. Self-preservation was. But the effect was the same. Silas read all 9 pages. That took him 7 minutes, and Royce filled the 7 minutes doing color commentary for the cameras, and Silas let him, the way granite lets rain. He read the property description. He read the conveyance of contents. He read the as-is clause, the waiver, the merger clause that said this document supersedes all prior discussions, which is a sentence lawyer's right to protect the seller, and which, that morning, protected the buyer instead, because it meant nobody could ever come back and claim the joke had been legally a joke. The law does not grade your intentions. It grades your signature. Then he counted out the transmission money, and I will tell you now what nobody in that room knew. The envelope was marked Carr in Marguerite's handwriting, because it came from her kitchen drawer, from her envelope system, the one he had kept using for 3 years, because throwing it out felt like losing her a second time. He paid for his future with an envelope his dead wife had labeled. And if you think a detail like that is small, you have never buried anybody. The notary stamped. The cameras got their shot. Royce got his line, the janitor bought the bakery, and by 4 that afternoon a 90-second clip was cut and posted by the docuseries, framed exactly the way Royce wanted it framed. Quirky founder, colorful gesture, dying store. Somebody in the comments set it to banjo music. Royce flew back to Nashville, feeling like a man who had turned a demolition line item into a marketing win, and that night at a steakhouse, he told the story twice. And Silas Freeman drove the 11 minutes home to Kerr Avenue, hung his jacket on the peg by the door, took Marguerite's photograph down off the hallway shelf, and sat with it at the kitchen table a long while in the dark. Then he said out loud in the empty house, "I am going to need you close on this one, Margie." And then he made a pot of coffee at 9 o'clock at night, took down a fresh spiral notebook, the same drugstore kind he had bought for 40 years, and wrote a single line at the top of the first page. September 16, they gave it all back. Now finish it excellent. At 5:40 the next morning, a Sunday, wearing the blue chambray shirt with the turned collar and the hidden patch, Silas Freeman unlocked the front door of the building he now owned, caught the screen so it would not bang, walked past the broom rack without stopping, and stood at the top of the switchback stair behind the walk-in cooler with a heavy flashlight in his hand and his heart going like a young man's. Then he turned the handle he had refused to turn for 3 years and went down to meet the paper. The basement under the Vance Avenue store was 50 feet by 80, dry as a sermon, and lit by 4 bulbs on pull chains that Silas replaced before he touched a single box. Because you do not read evidence by flashlight if you can help it, and because order was how the man prayed. It took him the whole first day just to walk it. Pallets stood in rows like a library that had given up on itself, shrink wrap gone yellow, and on the end of each pallet a moving company's inventory sticker, dated 2015, which meant that somewhere there was a manifest, and a manifest is a map. He found it taped inside the lid of the first box he opened, because Cordelia Delacroix's people had been the kind of people who taped the map inside the lid. I want to be precise about what happened in that basement over the following weeks, because this is the point in a lazy story where somebody reaches for magic. And nothing that happened to Royce Delacroix was magic. Every single thing that happened to him was filed. Silas worked evenings and weekends, alone at first, in the chambray shirt with a card table, a lamp, a box of manila folders from an office supply store on Poplar, and the spiral notebook. He did not ransack the place, he inventoried it, box by box, a log of what was in it and where it now sat, dated and initialed on every page S. F. Because a man who spent 28 years passing supplier audits and health inspections knows in his bones that evidence is only ever as strong as the story of who touched it and when. Later, a federal investigator would look at that handwritten inventory, all 131 pages of it, and tell a colleague quietly that in 30 years he had never once received documents from a private citizens in better order. On the 11th evening, on a pallet in the far corner, under a box of old radio ad reels, he found the green cloth-bound ledger with the black spine. He knew it before his hand even reached it. He sat down on an upturned milk crate, laid the ledger across his knees, and opened it to the page he had watched an accountant fill in June of 1998. And there it was, in fading blue fountain ink. Freeman, Silas J., 10%, in recognition of extraordinary and continuing contributions. And beneath the ledger, in the same box, the minute book itself, and inside the minute book on onion skin, the resolution, signed by every director of a folding table board, all of them gone now except the paper. Paper outlives everybody. Silas Freeman sat on a milk crate in a basement his own humiliation had bought him, holding proof that he owned a tenth of everything the man upstairs had ever bragged about, and he did not shout, and he did not weep. He took the King Edward cigar box out of his bag, the one from South Parkway, and he laid the fourth-grade long division paper down on top of the 1998 resolution for a moment, just so the 2 pages could meet, and he said, "Thank you, Mama," out loud, to a room full of boxes. Then he slid everything into acid-free sleeves he had bought 2 weeks earlier, 'cause he had believed, and belief that buys the sleeves in advance is the kind of belief that moves mountains. If the story ended there, it would already be a story. It does not end there, because the ledger was only the second most important thing in that basement. The most important thing filled 38 boxes along the south wall, and it was the reason Royce Delacroix should have paid any price on earth to keep strangers out of that room. When headquarters scanned its active files in 2015, active meant whatever the consultant said it meant. And what it did not mean was the dense, boring, stapled paper trail of how the company actually ran its kitchens and paid its people. Down it all went. And in that exhaust, once a man who had personally designed the company's operations began to read it with a baker's eye and an operator's memory. There was a pattern. Here is how it worked in plain language, because you are going to follow every step of this, and you deserve to. There are 2 ways a food company can quietly steal, and Royce's people had found both. The first is from the customer, and the second is from the worker, and the paper in that basement held them both. Start with the recipes, because that is where the theft was oldest and most personal. When Royce launched the reformulated commercial line, the cheaper co-packed line, he needed the formulas to taste close enough to the originals to fool a shelf. And so his consultants had, in 2016, lifted the core formulations straight out of the leather book, the book that was half in Silas's handwriting, and filed them as company trade secrets. And then, in 2018, the company had gone a step further and filed to trademark the names of 3 of the signature breads that Silas and Cordelia had named together in 1994, as if they had been invented in a Nashville office the year before. It is one thing to inherit a recipe. It is another thing to stand in front of a camera and retire the book you have been quietly strip mining for years. The paper showed the dates. The paper always shows the dates. But the recipes were the wound to Silas's pride. The second pattern was the wound to the law, and it had a name, and human beings on the other end of it. In box 29, then box 30, then box 31, Silas found the payroll records for the 6 highest volume cafés, the flagship urban stores, and reading them was like a choir master hearing every flat note in a hymn. Time records that had been edited after the fact, always downward, always shaving the same 15 and 20-minute increments off the front and back of shifts. Bakers clocked out automatically at 40 hours by a scheduling system Royce's people had configured to do exactly that, while the ovens ran and the sign-in sheets showed those same bakers still in the building. Overtime earned and never paid. Rest breaks logged that a second set of production logs proved had never been taken, because you cannot proof 40 trays of dough and take your break at the same time, and the dough does not lie about when it went in the oven. Silas had spent his whole life keeping Cordelia's kitchens clean enough that a health inspector or a labor auditor could walk in unannounced and leave impressed. Reading these pages, he could see the machine he had built being run in reverse, to grind the very people who stood where he had once stood. He filled 19 pages of the spiral notebook with pay period numbers before he stopped counting and started organizing. And then, in box 34, he found the letters. And the letters are where this stopped being about money, even the money that was rightfully his. There were 14 of them, held together with a rusted binder clip, addressed over the years to the company's HR office and forwarded, the routing stamps showed, to the desk of the same regional director who had configured the timekeeping, where they had gone to die. 14 employees, most of them women, most of them black or brown, who had written in plain, careful, apologetic language to say that their hours not match checks, that they had worked through breaks they were marked as taking, that they had been told overtime was not authorized while being scheduled into it. Some of the letters asked only to be heard. None of them had ever received an answer that was not a form. Silas could not forget these, because the 9th letter in the stack was signed Loretta Biggs. And Silas Freeman had known Loretta Biggs for 30 years, because she had sung in the choir at Mount Pisgah since before his wedding. And he had stood in the church parking lot and heard her say that she had left the bakery job she loved because the checks never owned money, and she was too proud to keep begging for her own money. Everyone in that parking lot had shaken their heads at her bad luck. It was not luck. It was a setting in a piece of software. Her letter was polite. She apologized in her own complaint for taking up their time. Silas read that letter twice, set it down, walked to the far end of the basement, and stood facing the wall a while. And if you have followed this man from a kitchen table on South Parkway to this basement, you know the wall was in more danger in that moment than it had been in 50 years of his life. Then he came back, sat down, and wrote at the top of a fresh notebook page, in careful letters, Loretta first. Everyone else after. We answer ugly with excellent now. What does a 63-year-old man with a green ledger, 38 boxes, and 14 letters actually do? He does not call a press conference. He does not post a video of his own. He does the thing he could not afford to do in 2011, and it is the thing every underestimated person in this country should hear said slowly. He gets himself a very good lawyer, and he walks in with the paper already organized. Her name was Corinne Vaughn, 56 years old, a commercial and employment litigator in Memphis who had grown up in Orange Mound and put herself through law school, waiting tables on Beale, 29 years of fraud and wage and hour and fiduciary cases, and a reputation among opposing counsel you could read in the way they said her name. She took one case a year on pure contingency, if the case had what she called good bones. Silas got her name from the barbecue man in Southaven, whose family she had once saved. He called her office on a Tuesday. Her assistant offered him 15 minutes on a Thursday. He arrived 11 minutes early, in the chambray shirt, carrying 2 banker's boxes, and the 15 minutes turned into 4 hours, and at some point, Corinne Vaughn quietly canceled the rest of her afternoon. When he finished laying it out, the ledger, the resolution, the inventory log, the payroll analysis in his own hand, the 14 letters, she sat back, took off her glasses, and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Freeman, in 29 years I have had clients bring me a smoking gun. You have brought me the armory with a card catalog." And he said, "My mama raised me to be right." Corinne Vaughn put her glasses back on and said, "God bless your mama." Now here is how we are going to be right in the correct order. The correct order. Write that phrase somewhere you will see it, because everything that follows from it. Revenge is loud and fast, and it usually ends with the loud man in handcuffs of his own making. A reckoning is quiet and sequenced, and it never throws a single punch it cannot document. Corinne Vaughn built the sequence on a legal pad that first afternoon, and it had 4 steps, and each step loaded the next. Step 1, before anything else, quietly. She brought in a forensic accountant, an unhurried and precise man named Theo Marsh, who had spent a decade auditing hospitality payrolls before going private. And for 9 weeks, In that basement, under the 4 new bulbs, Theo Marsh and 2 associates rebuilt the wage scheme pay period by pay period, cross-referenced against the production in the boxes that were Royce's movers had not sorted. Because Royce's movers had not sorted, they had shoveled. The final memorandum ran 190 pages, estimated unpaid and unlawfully withheld wages across 6 cafés, 2016 through 2022, with liquidated damages, $4.6 million, owed to more than 300 current and former hourly workers. And Appendix C, the 14 letters, names, and dates laid against the very pay periods the software had shaved. Wire and mail cross state lines in the grocery line billing, which are the 2 words that turn a labor dispute into the kind of file a federal prosecutor opens on a slow Monday. Step 2, and this is the move that tells you an operations man helped write the strategy. A man who had spent his life inside how a food company actually keeps its books. Not the government first, the franchise system and the lender first. A company that has systematically shaved its own workers is a company that has been lying on the documents it hands its bank and its business partners. And Delacroix's entire 91 café footprint floated on borrowed money, an inventory and expansion line secured against the stores. And every loan agreement of that kind contains that covenants, representations, that the borrower is in compliance with wage and hour law, and is not the subject of undisclosed liabilities. Corinne Vaughn's letter to the bank's outside counsel was 6 pages and attached 40 exhibits, and it did not threaten. It informed. The bank's risk committee, which is a room with no sentiment in it at all, was asking Royce for a meeting within 3 weeks. They came polite. They left grim. Step 3. The civil case, Silas's own. Freeman versus Delacroix, Provisions and Royce Delacroix individually, filed in Chancery Court in Shelby County for conversion of his 10% interest, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraud. And to the defense that 12 years had gone by, Corinne Vaughn attached the 2011 story in advance and turned it into a weapon, because Tennessee law, like the law of most states, stops the clock when a defendant fraudulently conceals the claim. And what do you call it when the man who controls the corporate records looks a shareholder in the eye and tells him no record of his shares exists, while the ledger and the resolution sit in a building that same man controls? You call it fraudulent concealment, counselor, and you prove it with the defendant's own basement. The complaint noted, almost gently, that the plaintiff had declined to sign the 2011 release. The $35,000 Royce saved that spring turned out to be the most expensive money he never spent. Step 4. Last, the referrals, complete and organized and unbegged, to the State Department of Labor and to the United States Attorney for the Western District of Tennessee. Corinne Vaughn's rule was simple. Hand the government a case so clean that declining it is more work than taking it. And underneath the 4 steps, before all of them, there was a step 0, and it was Silas's alone. And Corinne argued against it for a full day on strategy grounds, and then stopped arguing the moment she saw his face. Before a single letter went to the bank, Silas Freeman drove to a duplex off Kansas Street, with a cashier's check for the back wages and the interest, $3,200 and change, sat at Loretta Biggs's kitchen table, told her only that an old bookkeeping error had been found in her favor, drank her sweet tea, and let her praise God without correcting a word of it. 13 more checks went out the same month by mail, from his own account, before a single motion was ever ruled on. That was his pension and the last of the transmission money. Some debts you pay before anyone rules on them, or you were never really owed anything to begin with. Now here is a question for you, and I want you to answer it honestly when we get to the end. 12 years. If a person had done to you what was done to Silas Freeman, could you have waited 12 years, and then, holding the knife at last, used it this carefully? Or would the loudness have taken you first? Do not answer too fast. The loudness takes almost everybody. Before I show you the fall, I owe you the winter, because the 14 months between the filing and the collapse were not a montage. And this channel does not sell you montages. They were the kind of months that do not photograph well, and if you skip them, you will learn the wrong lesson from this whole story. You will learn that proof wins. Proof does not win. Proof plus endurance wins, and endurance is paid for in ways no court ever reimburses. Start with the money, because Silas would want you to see the ledger. Corinne Vaughn worked the case on contingency, but contingency pays the lawyer. not the war. Theo Marsh's 9 weeks of forensic work cost real money. Climate control for the basement, the acid-free sleeves, fireproof cabinets, certified copies, process servers, an expert on Tennessee corporations who charged $600 an hour to say, in effect, that a ledger is a ledger. Silas had already emptied his savings into the 14 checks. In February, he took a mortgage against the house off Kerr Avenue, the house he and Marguerite had burned the note on in 2013 with a fish fry in the backyard, and the loan officer at the credit union, a woman who had been in Marguerite's 4th grade class in 1994, processed the paperwork with her jaw set and said only, "You get them, Mr. Freeman." He slept in that house every night of the war and never once told his niece it was collateral. She found out the way we are finding out. From the record. Then the town, because a city is a single nervous system, and Vance Avenue runs right through the heart of this one. For the first few months before the filings went public, all Memphis knew was that 90-second clip, and the clip, you remember, was cut to Royce's rhythm. The janitor who bought the dead bakery. Somebody added the banjo. At the barbershop on Airways, a man Silas had known 40 years said, laughing, "Not unkind, what you fixing to sell down there, Silas? Day old Brett." And Silas laughed right along with him, because his mother's arithmetic had taught him that a man who cannot be laughed at cannot wait, and waiting was the tire plan. But do not let his calm fool you about the price of it. There is a tax on being publicly foolish while privately right, and it is collected daily, in the glance at the grocery store, in the tone of an old friend, in the sermon illustration you suspect is aimed at you. He paid that tax every day for over a year and never once itemized it to a living soul. He was not entirely alone, and the record should show that too. Bet Oduya came by on Saturdays with a foil pan of jollof and sat with him in the basement while he worked, telling 20 years of kitchen stories, asking nothing. Dana Whitfield, who by then had been pushed out of the company on a paperwork pretext everyone understood, drove over one evening in the hatchback with a box of her own, lawful copies she had kept of her write-up and her termination file, and set it on the card table, and said, "I don't know if this helps anything, but you nodded at me, so..." It went into the inventory, dated and initialed, and months later, when the pattern of what happened to employees who spoke up became relevant in a courtroom, it helped more than she ever imagined. The choir at Mount Pisgah, who did not know the details and did not ask, took to laying a hand on his shoulder on the way past his pew, one after another, all winter long. If you have never been carried by a church that has decided not to ask you a single question, I cannot explain it to you, and if you have, I do not need to. And then there was the night in January that I will hand to you carefully, because it is the closest this man ever came to the edge of himself. The case had hit its slow season, motions pending, everything underwater, nothing visibly moving. The mortgage payment had cleared that morning. The banjo clip had surfaced again with fresh jokes under it, and Silas Freeman, 62 years old, sat at the kitchen table off Kerr Avenue at 2 in the morning with the spiral notebook closed in front of him, and, for the first time since September, did not know what to write in it. He got up, walked to the hall closet, and took down Marguerite's yellow robe, which he had never once moved, and he held it, standing in the dark hallway, a long time. A weaker story would give you a vision here, a voice, a sign in the window. I am going to give you what actually happened, because it is better. Nothing happened. The furnace clicked on. A freight train went by 2 blocks over, the way trains had gone by his whole life, and in the quiet after it he heard his own memory say the sentence in her voice, "Finish it excellent, baby." And he hung the robe back on its hook, squared it on the hanger the way she would have, went back to the kitchen, opened the notebook, and wrote one line. January 22. Still right. Went to bed. That is what faith looks like at 2 in the morning in a house with a new mortgage on it. It does not glow. It squares a robe on a hanger and writes down the date. Hold that winter in your mind while you watch what comes next, because next comes the part that looks like lightning. And I need you to remember that lightning is only a long, slow charge that finally found its path to the ground. Royce Delacroix learned that Silas Freeman existed, in the legal sense, on a Tuesday in February, 14 months after the launch, when 3 things arrived in a single week like weather fronts colliding. The bank's notice of default and demand for immediate assurances. The sheriff's service of the Shelby County complaint. and a letter from the grocery chain that carried the retail line, whose compliance department read the trade press and wanted to discuss the wage allegations before the next purchase order. He called his general counsel into the glass office in Nashville, threw the complaint across the desk, and demanded to know how a janitor had gotten their payroll files. And Adele Cohn, a careful lawyer who kept her own file of every warning she had ever given, said in a voice witnesses in the hallway described as older than the room, "He did not get them, Royce. You conveyed them. All fixtures, equipment, files, recipes, records, and contents. I asked you twice. You told me the trash could convey with the trash. There is video of that morning in September. There always was. The lawyers on every side of what followed watched that 90-second clip more times than anyone could count, and it never once changed. A joke only stays a joke as long as nobody accepts it, and paper does not care why you signed. What happened next took 13 months, and it happened the way avalanches happen, which is to say slowly, and then all at once, and entirely according to physics that were set in place before the first snow ever moved. Royce's defense lawyers, good ones, billed him a fortune to attack the chain of custody, and were met with 131 pages of dated, initialed inventory and the sworn testimony of Theo Marsh. They floated the theory that the documents had been stolen, and were met with the purchase agreement, the notary, and the docuseries footage, and a judge whose that contents clause allowed from the bench without inflection, which is the worst possible way to hear your own sentence read back to you. They argued the statute of limitations, and Corinne Vaughn called their own former general counsel, and Adele Cohn, under subpoena, no longer a friend to anyone but the truth, testified to the 2011 meeting, to the elimination of the operations role, and to the morning of the launch, including the wave. 3 inches of a man's wrist entered into the record. The deposition of Royce Delacroix lasted 2 days, and one exchange from it traveled among lawyers the way these things travel, until it was quoted in a bar journal. Corinne Vaughn slid the 1998 resolution across the table and asked him to read the names of the signatories aloud, and he did, his grandmother's last. She asked him when he had first laid eyes on the document. He said he had never seen it before this litigation. She asked him then, on what basis he had told Mr. Freeman in 2011 that he had been through the corporate records and no such interest existed. And the record shows a pause of some length, and then the witness answered, "I meant the records I had." And Corinne Vaughn said, "No further questions on that point, which lawyers will tell you is the sound a trap makes when it closes softly." The Department of Labor opened its own investigation and issued findings. The grocery chain, unwilling to carry the reputational load, suspended the retail line and then terminated the supply agreement for cause. The bank, contractually entitled and institutionally without sentiment, called the line. $240 million against a company that could no longer certify its own compliance. The board that Royce had stocked with friends discovered, the way such boards always do, that friendship has a fiduciary ceiling. Facing personal exposure, they voted to remove him as chief executive in the summer, and to put Delacroix provisions into Chapter 11 that fall, in the bankruptcy court in Memphis, a mile from the tasting room where the whole thing had started. The federal grand jury's subpoenas arrived after that. Royce Delacroix surrendered his passport before the year was out, and his lawyers began negotiating over the word restitution, and his house up in Nashville went on the market with an agent who described it as an entertainer's dream. I am not going to tell you the man's sentence, because at the time this story closes that number belonged to a judge and not to us, and this channel does not invent what a court has not yet said. What I will tell you is what the paper had already made certain. The empire was gone from him. Every cafe, every contract, every inch of his grandmother's name, exactly as promised in minute 9. And now the part you have been waiting for since the title, the part the lawyers in this story call the turn. A company in Chapter 11 with a valuable brand and a poisoned owner is not scrapped. It is sold under Section 363 of the Bankruptcy Code, cleaned of its old liabilities by the court, to the best qualified buyer the estate can find. So consider what the estate's people saw that autumn when a bid came in from a partnership called Freeman Provisions. Its lead investor held a proven judgment against the estate, 10% ownership plus damages, plus the interest of 12 years, which the court-approved settlement let him apply directly against the purchase price. Its operating plan was a set of systems the company's own field staff had been running, badly, for a decade, written originally in the bidder's own hand. Its financing came from a black-owned bank on the same avenue where the founder's mother had once entered a restaurant through the kitchen door, whose chief credit officer read Theo Marsh's memorandum twice and said, "This is the safest loan in Shelby County, because this man audits himself." And its principal was a 64-year-old baker, whose name, it turned out, was already in half the handwriting of the recipe book the company had been trying to retire. The sale closed on a Thursday in April at 11:15 in the morning, in a courtroom on Adams Avenue, 19 months, almost to the week, after a Saturday in September. 91 cafés. The signature page reached Silas Freeman, and this time he took out of his shirt pocket not the cheap ballpoint but a fountain pen, because some signatures you make with the same pen you sign a check with, and some you make with a better one. And he signed his name full and legible, pressing hard, so that nobody could ever pretend they did not know who had signed. Corinne Vaughn leaned over and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Freeman." And Silas looked at the page a moment and said, "My mother told me being seen was their job to fix." Took them 53 years. Then he went home and wore the chambray shirt to church on Sunday and let Mount Pisgah make all the noise he would not make himself. There was exactly one meeting between the two men after the courtroom, and only one, and I am going to give it to you exactly. Because what a man does with total victory tells you more about him than anything he does in defeat. It happened in a hallway outside a deposition room, late that spring, unscheduled the way the worst and the best moments always are. Royce Delacroix came out of one door aged 10 years and 14 months, tie loose, lawyers flanking him like nurses. Silas came out of another, in a gray suit now, because owners wear suits to depositions, with the chambray shirt underneath it, because some clothes are a hand on your shoulder. The hallway went quiet. Royce looked at him, and everyone braced for something, and what came out of the man was almost a whisper. "You could have just told me, that morning, who you were, what was down in that basement. You could have said something." And Silas Freeman looked at him, not unkindly, and gave him one sentence, and then walked on to the elevator. "I spent 28 years telling you, son. You were the one holding the microphone." He did not look back. The doors closed. Corinne Vaughn, who saw it, said afterward that she had watched 1,000 confrontations in her career, and that was the only one she ever saw where the winner left the room heavier than he came in, because mercy weighs more than triumph, and Silas carried both. Now let me tell you what a man builds when the building is finally his, because if this story were only about a fall, it would not be worth an hour of your life. Falls are cheap. What Silas Freeman did with 91 cafés is the actual ending, and it started on his first Monday as owner at 7 in the morning, on the floor of the Vance Avenue kitchen, where a 64-year-old man in a chambray shirt stood in the middle of the room saying nothing, just listening to the ovens the way a woman named Cordelia had taught him to 40 years before, while the bakers came in one by one and understood, some of them with tears they blamed on the cold walk-in, exactly whose company they worked for now. Dana Whitfield was working at a title company out by the interstate by then, because the pretext had held and the job had not come back. The letter she received that April was 2 paragraphs long and signed by hand, and it did not offer her the old counter job. It offered her a new one that did not exist yet, director of people and fair pay for the whole group, reporting to the owner, with one written mandate. Every complaint, every letter, every discrepancy, answered by a human being within 72 hours. And a standing rule, engraved at Silas's instruction on a small steel plate mounted at eye level beside the time clock in all 91 stores, where the framed mission statements used to hang. The plate says 4 sentences. Every letter gets an answer. Every answer gets a name. If we were wrong, we say so first and fix it fast. A time record is a person. Dana read that offer 3 times in her hatchback in a parking lot and called her mother before she called anyone else. At the event announcing the group's new leadership, a reporter asked her why the owner had chosen someone so young for such a visible role, and Dana said, "Because one morning I said 9 words out loud, and he never forgot them." And I have thought every day since about all the rooms I have been quiet in. Write that down." The reporter did, and it ran, and it is the best sentence in this whole story that Silas Freeman did not say. Bet Oduya, 68, was asked to unretire for 1 year as what Silas called the group's master of the craft, teaching young bakers the old woman's first rule, which was that you feed a customer the way you would feed your own mother, honestly and twice as carefully. Bet cried on the phone and denied it for else to rev her life. Adele Cohn left the company and, the following spring, was seen quietly teaching a compliance seminar for small businesses without a fee, which is the closest thing to penance the profession allows. And Silas let her, because Silas kept a private ledger of who had warned twice, and who had only ever asked what 10%. Loretta Biggs came back to sing and to run the front counter of the Vance Avenue store 2 days a week. Not because she needed the work, but because Silas asked her to. And on her first morning back, he walked her down the switchback stair and stood her in a clean, well-lit basement, empty now except for one green cloth-bound ledger in a glass case, and told her the whole story, plainly, without decoration, the way you hand somebody a warm loaf. The scholarship fund was announced on the 9th of March, which was not an accident, at Mount Pisgah, from the same fellowship hall, where a wedding had happened in 1989 with $60 of carnations. The Verna Freeman Excellence Fund, seeded with $2 million of the settlement and named for the woman who baked downtown for 30 years and was never once allowed on the menu, pays full culinary and trade school tuition, tools, and a stipend for young people from South Memphis entering the food trades, with exactly one himself in a single draft, which Silas wrote himself in a single draft. Tell us about a time you were right and nobody believed you. What did you do next? There is a courtesy van now, free, that runs a loop between the Southside neighborhoods and the Vance Avenue store. Because Silas had read all 14 letters again the week the sale closed and noticed that 4 of them mentioned, in passing, apologetically, the difficulty of getting to work without a car. The van is called the Marguerite, and if you ask the driver why, he will tell you, because the owner's wife believed everybody deserves to get where they are going. And on a Saturday morning in September, 1 year to the day after the launch, Silas Freeman held a small gathering of his own on the same tasting room floor, with pastries from the same butcher paper, and 53 chairs set out on purpose. And he stood without a riser and without a microphone, because the room was quiet enough to hear him, and he said this: "A year ago, a man stood right here and told you what this building was worth. He was off by 91 cafés and 1 human being. That is the most expensive appraisal in the history of Tennessee, and I want it to teach all of us the same thing it taught me. In this company, nobody is furniture. Now let's get to work. The doors open at 9. They repainted the window that month, and the whole street watched to see what name would go up, and here is what went up, in navy on gold: Delacroix and Freeman. His people asked him why on earth he kept the name of the family that had done this to him, and Silas said, that name belonged to Cordelia before it ever belonged to her grandson. And that woman paid for half of everything I know. You do not erase a grandmother because of a grandson. I had that done to me once. I know exactly how it feels. The screen door on the alley side still slaps shut the same tired way. The renovation budget had a line to fix it, $940 approved, and Silas crossed it out himself with a felt pen and wrote in the margin, in careful letters, "Leave it." Every morning, the owner of 91 bakeries arrives at 6:50, catches that door with his heel the way everyone in that building has learned to for 40 years, and steps inside. Some men fix a slapping door. Some men keep one, so that every single morning, on the threshold of everything they own, their own body reminds them what it cost and how it opened. So what do you and I carry home from Silas Freeman? Let me try to say it the way his mother would have wanted it said, plainly. They will price you in front of a crowd. They will hold the microphone and set your number, and the crowd will laugh, because the crowd has rent due, and the silence of good people will be the loudest sound in the room. And in that moment you will have 2 choices that look identical from the outside, and could not be more different underneath. You can collect the grievance, and it will feed on you for years and leave you hungrier every year. Or you can collect the proof and keep your receipts and your dignity in the same envelope, and wait and work and be right so thoroughly, so patiently, and in such good order, that when the day finally comes, you do not even have to raise your voice. The paper speaks. The paper always speaks. Paper outlives everybody, and so does excellence. And so, I am telling you, does a mother's sentence spoken over a kitchen table when a boy came home with his arithmetic marked wrong. Royce Delacroix assigned a man a value of $2,118 in front of 2 cameras. 19 months later, that man owned all 91 of his stores. The number was never the price of the janitor. The number was the price of the mistake. And the mistake was believing that a uniform tells you anything at all about the mind inside it. You do not need to be seen. You need to be right. Being seen is their job to fix. And sooner or later, they always have to fix it.